I think I'm owed an apology from Penn State fans who've been in my comments for 3 weeks talking about how Ole Miss's offense couldn't handle the Big Ten defense. Come on, man. This is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, I'm Stephen Willis, a former staff member at Ole Miss and a 10-year veteran of the national media at Yahoo Sports. I also did a little stint at WSMV Nashville. Thanks for joining us. Today on the show, we'll tell you what we learned in the Peach Bowl in that dominating win by Ole Miss over Penn State. As I mentioned, I'm Stephen Willis, and this is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We, of course, are free and available on all podcast apps and YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day, and a special thanks go out to the everydayers that make the show what it is. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 money line bet. That's $150 back, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. Anyway, honestly, this game, Ole Miss just absolutely boat raced Penn State. The score is going to look flattering, and you're going to look at it as like 38-25. Okay, that wasn't too bad, but that was a whooping. That was a real whooping. And if it wasn't for two tip pass, lucky long pass plays, you're looking at 38-3 going into the fourth quarter. Really, really interesting stuff. They used trick plays and they schemed some stuff up from time to time, but they could not put anything together against Ole Miss's defense. Ole Miss was actually the better team in this football game. And if you look at the end of the third quarter or the middle of the third quarter, you could see the looks on Penn State's players' faces. They knew this game was over. They knew they were not as good. They just wanted to get back to State College, Pennsylvania, and for all of this to be put behind them. And that was interesting to me. And we're going to talk in this show about what we thought about, obviously, this game. This was Ole Miss kind of announcing their arrival on the scene. We'll put this up right now. And also that Ole Miss is probably a favorite to host a 2024 playoff game. Big time stuff from Ole Miss in this game. They played really, really well. Jaxson Dart was absolutely nails as well. They had the best players, probably the best 3 or 4 players on the field of both offense and defense. Penn State has a good defense. I'm not going to take anything away from their defense. They couldn't match up with Caden Prescorn. They had nobody that could do that. They had nobody that could match up with Trey Harris. Their only hope to stop Quinshon Judkins was by doing the engage 8-0 blitz type stuff. And whenever the quick game got started for Ole Miss and they just couldn't do that because of the fear of God, basically, that was put in by Trey Harris and Caden Prescorn and Ole Miss's receivers, all of a sudden they couldn't do that. Quinshon goes for 100 yards as well. Jaxson Dart, was it 30 for 47 or something like that, just throwing the football? It really, really impressive. We're going to bring up his numbers in a later segment. But overall, it was a completely dominating performance, and I'm extremely happy to end this bowl season and ended this 2023 season like this. This is a big thing. We're going to talk about what this means from the next segment to the segment after that. For the next 9 months worth of segments, we're probably going to be talking about the playoff because Ole Miss is firmly in there. Ole Miss has pieces coming in. They have retention on some really good pieces. We're going to talk about all of that just basically ad nauseum for the next 9 months. We are going to have some fun talking about Ole Miss football because we deserve to have some fun watching Ole Miss football. So this Peach Bowl was interesting. The first drive of the game, Penn State ran it straight down the field. We talked about how schematically Ole Miss, if they're not careful and the other team knows what's going on, they can kind of formation themselves into letting the offense out leverage them. And if that happens, the run game opens up. You basically run yourself out of the play. You're going against the slant, that type of stuff. Once Ole Miss essentially just went to a base defense, now they probably did some cover 4, they probably did some cover 1, all of that stuff. But the nuts and bolts of the defense, it became very simple defensively, and Ole Miss just whooped them. The offensive line couldn't get any movement. They tried their run game stuff and just slowed them down. And the Penn State third down problems, Drew Aller is not a good quarterback. He's not. He's not. He played 3 good football teams this year and had less than 50% completion percentage. He's not a good quarterback. Third down, he struggled in third down, almost got him to third down, let him struggle, got the ball back, went against that number 1 rated defense, straight down the field and scored a touchdown. Ole Miss had 31 points with like 8 minutes to go in the third quarter. To that point, Ole Miss went into 4-minute offense because they knew there was no chance of Penn State scoring 2 times the rest of that game. And the only way Penn State could win that game is through a disastrous play. So just run the ball 3 times, punt the ball back, get it back when Penn State inevitably can't do it. And they got a garbage touchdown late in the game, but it ended up 38-25. Offensively, that was not a good football team. Offensively, that offense was on par with Arkansas and Mississippi State and of offenses that Ole Miss has seen this year. And we told everybody coming into this game that Pete Golding has feasted on mid to bad offenses. And honestly, I think I gave Penn State's offense a little bit too much credit. These guys were bad, legitimately bad by SEC standards. And if they were the top offense in the Big Ten, and I will say that again if you need me to say it, they were the top offense in the Big Ten. If that happens and that's going on, I think all the defensive numbers in that conference just needs to be wiped clean because they're garbage. Now, they have some good, talented players that are probably going to be good pros, but the offenses are so bad. There's no tempo. There's no things that innovate in college football in that conference that whenever they saw against Missouri, Brady Cook did not have a good game in the Missouri-Ohio State game. He honestly had a bad game. There was a situation where they had trouble blocking one particular Ohio State defensive lineman. Mizzou still won that game by 11 points. Ole Miss won their bowl game by 13 points. The moral of this story, honestly, probably is take Alabama in the points, take Tennessee in the points, take LSU in the points. Because if what we've seen from Ohio State and Penn State, 2 of the 3 blue bloods of that conference, do we honestly think they're going to be able to bully Alabama? Is that the mindset? Now, it might happen. It could surprise all of us. Alabama could have a bad game. Jalen Milroe could come in and throw the ball to the other team 3 or 4 times. But if judging by what we saw in an SEC versus Big Ten matchup, Missouri versus Ohio State, Ole Miss versus Penn State, 2 non-traditional teams in the SEC against 2 blue bloods of the Big Ten, and that is what happened. And Michigan struggled to beat Ohio State. Michigan struggled to beat Penn State. That's what happens. Do you think you're going to be able to line up and just run the ball at will against Alabama's defense? It seems like to me it's a recipe for a disaster, honestly. But it should be really interesting to see how it goes. I'm pretty fired up about that. And thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen of the day. We're just getting started. This game was about Ole Miss announcing their arrival on the national stage. I don't care what you think about your program. I don't honestly care what outsiders think about Ole Miss. They're about to hear about Ole Miss for about 9 months. But I do want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is easy to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like same game parlays, and you can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub. It's the best way to find the popular ones as well and more. So visit fanduel.com/lockedon to make your first bet a layup. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows that cover every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, so Ole Miss handled, honestly, they just kind of dominated a little bit Penn State. It was a situation where I was expecting more in that game, but it just happened. But on top of everything else, Ole Miss got all the pub going into that game, that lead up. That was straight game day into that game. They talked about Reese Davis on there in College Game Day, talking about how Ole Miss is going to be a top 5 team nationally going into 2024 with the win over Penn State. There was a lot of stuff on the line. All the talking heads on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, they followed suit a little bit as well. And all Ole Miss had to do was win this game. And Ole Miss won it in such a convincing, dominating fashion. They are going to be the darlings of college football going into 2024. You know, you have a situation looking at like Jaxson Dart. Jaxson Dart has not officially announced that he's coming back. It is mostly assumed that he is coming back. Him and Quinshon Judkins, both, all of the major weapons on Ole Miss team is either agreed to come back or it's widely assumed that they will come back. But Jaxson Dart this year was 233 for 358, 3,364 yards, 23 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Great year 2 numbers for a Jaxson or Lane Kiffin quarterback. Now we get to see the rarest of rare potentially going into 2024, and that is a year 3 quarterback in a Lane Kiffin offense. And with Ole Miss being positioned the way they are, it should be very interesting. I'm very fired up about that. I think Jaxson Dart, at the time that they played teams, okay, he's beaten 3 teams in his 2 years that at the time of the game was ranked inside the top 13. He has a win over number 7 Kentucky. I don't care how they finished. They played the game then. That counts as a top 10 win. Number 10 Penn State, this game in the Peach Bowl, played very well in that. He played pretty well in the Kentucky game as well, even though that was in 2022. And then we all know what happened in the LSU game where Jaxson Dart completely balled out. When Ole Miss's quarterbacks play very well, like we've seen in this Lane Kiffin system, they can beat anyone. The only chance that you have, honestly, to beat these Lane Kiffin teams as talent gets accumulated and they get better and better and better is to have the quarterback to affect him in some sort of a negative way. Right now, this year, there were 2 teams that could do that. And they were probably the 2 best teams in the country. And they played those games on the road. So in front of 100,000 in Bryant-Denny Stadium, in front of 95,000 in Sanford Stadium, those were the 2 big environments where the quarterback got affected. When the quarterback does not get affected, you do not win. You don't. That is what has been built by Lane Kiffin right now. Now, going into the season, this was the challenge that Ole Miss had going into this season. And there's 2 schools of thought. One is based off of what Ole Miss has always been. You base your opinion based off of the way it's been over the last, 30, 40 years. To where Ole Miss is going to be good, they're not going to be great because Ole Miss isn't great. Ole Miss isn't talented. There's going to be major deficiencies. And the other side is this Ole Miss team was talented enough to do to other SEC teams what SEC teams used to do to Ole Miss, to where talent just kind of won out at the end of the game and Ole Miss won those games, where Ole Miss was clearly the better team. They might not have had the best plan that day. They might not have done everything they need to do to boat race them, but they were clearly the better, more talented team. And I think that is what happened this year. That's the reason Ole Miss won 11-2 this season, is because they were better than every team they played except for two. More talented, everything. Even when you look at the players in the secondary for LSU, Ole Miss was more talented than that team. When you look at the players in the secondary for Texas A&M, Ole Miss was more talented than that team. When Ole Miss needed to bear down and they were playing against a team that had a scary defensive front that they had to respect and that forced them to be really quick game, going quick game to deep game and to put their run offense in play as well, you actually got to see how this offense can look. And we saw the same thing against Penn State. There were pass rushers that Ole Miss needed to fear. Ole Miss figured out a way around them. Because when they do that and open up to where they can't engage 8, that opens up the run game, that opens up the pass game downfield, and you still have the quick stuff real quick, and the defense doesn't know which way you're going. I've told people all season long, when Ole Miss does this, they cannot be stopped. When Ole Miss gets braggadocious, arrogant, we should say, and everything is just basically a third level RPO where every pass is 2.5 seconds until the release and 17 to 20 yards downfield. We've seen those games. No quick game to speak of, and it's basically inside zone and that arrogant play calling because they don't respect the front and the front seven that they're seeing. All of a sudden, that could be problematic. Ole Miss kind of does that to themselves. Nobody is actually doing that to Ole Miss other than they can stop an inside zone play. They can get after you whenever they know that in 2.5 seconds, you're going to be right there. So this isn't a normal thing, but if Ole Miss just does this consistently to where the quick game happens, the ball gets out quickly, you move it downfield, use the middle of the field, all the stuff that me and Bill Flowers have been talking about over the course of the last 3 months, this offense in 2024 will not be stopped. I talked about how this offense had a chance to be elite going into the football season, and they're like, well, there was trouble running the football, yada, yada. It didn't necessarily materialize at that level. But when you look at games when Ole Miss does all of this, they open up the full playbook, so to speak. They have total respect for their opponent and what they can do in the front seven. It just opens up everything. It unlocks the defense in a way that Ole Miss has not been able to do that. And the defense truly cannot be right. Whenever that happens, this Ole Miss offense is completely special. We saw it 3 times this season. If Ole Miss can up that to 6 or 8 times in 2024, they could be lifting a trophy up at the end of it. And I'm not talking about a Peach Bowl trophy. I'm talking about one that goes in the trophy case and you point to on recruiting visits. I'm talking about that type trophy. I'm talking about putting a sign up in Vaught-Hemingway Stadium. That can happen if Ole Miss runs the offense the way they did against Penn State. We announced our arrival on the scene as Ole Miss, all of Ole Miss Nation, it announced that we're here on national television yesterday or 2 days ago. Our next step will be the next step, and that is win a little bit of silverware. That is do something a little bit differently. That is take that next step. We talked about many times during the season, opportunity. You want to keep getting in these games. You want to keep getting in these games because eventually is when you're knocking on the door, you're going to knock it down. You're going to be let in. It's going to handle it. Same thing happened to Clemson in 2014 or 2015 or whenever that was. When you have the quarterback play, which Ole Miss has an assembly line set up at quarterback right now. When you have the skill positions in place, I do think that Ole Miss needs some depth pieces on the offensive line. Not so much starters. They're not looking for starters. They do need some depth pieces on the offensive line. And with what's coming in on defense, we'll talk about that in the next segment as well. But I do want to thank everybody for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen. There's still more to come on the podcast. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Ole Miss now just isn't in the conversation for the playoff. They're in the conversation to host a playoff game. They're in a conversation for a bye game, and we'll talk about that up next. Thanks for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day, and shout out to the Everydayers. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows that cover every single league. For your second listen, go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube today and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 stream channel. Be part of history. So Ole Miss got a big win over Penn State. And it wasn't just the fact that they beat Penn State. It was the fact that Ole Miss won that game, the number beside the opponent, the whole 9 yards going in to next season, because we talked about what this could mean. Ole Miss needed national perception, which it was going into the season, that Lane Kiffin can't win the big one. Although in 2022, we know how it ended up. But when Ole Miss played Kentucky, Kentucky was 7th in the country. Jaxson Dart won that game. Jaxson Dart is actually 2-2 or 2-3 against top like 13 level teams in the last 2 years. Actually a fairly decent record. And the only teams that are truly kind of boat racing or are even able to win the game against Ole Miss at the moment are the Alabamas and the Georgias, and it's home games for them. We'll find out when Georgia comes to Oxford how that looks. And I'm expecting ABC primetime, the whole 9 yards, Kirk Herbstreit, all of those guys. Chris Fowler should be really cool. But Ole Miss just isn't just a favorite to make the playoffs like we've been talking about for 3 weeks anymore. Ole Miss has taken that next step to where they're going to be in the conversation to host a playoff game. And let's talk about that for a second. What will Oxford, Mississippi look like if Ole Miss hosts a playoff game? What will Oxford look like? Because I'm thinking 300,000 to 400,000 people will be in that town. Well, I talked to people that said it looked like Morgan Wallen whenever they did the concert there, and it might be worse than that because people are going to show up because that will be the biggest football game ever played in the state of Mississippi. Won't even particularly be close. Can you imagine if Michigan or Oregon or USC or somebody is going into Oxford, Mississippi for a playoff game? How big that would be, how big that would feel. And props to Lane Kiffin and Jaxson Dart and Quinshon Judkins, Trey Harris, and everybody associated with this program for getting Ole Miss into this position to the point where these games and these conversations get to happen. It wasn't long ago, 2019, the piss and the miss happened. Then Lane Kiffin came in, beat Indiana in year 1. Matt Corral got hurt in year 2. They lost the Sugar Bowl to the Baylor Bears. Year 3, they lost in the Texas Bowl to the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Year 4, they beat the Penn State Nittany Lions in the Peach Bowl. Actually, it didn't just beat them. They kind of embarrassed them a little bit. Penn State, if you looked on the sideline in the 3rd and 4th quarter, those kids just wanted to quit. They wanted to go home. They wanted it to all be over. And it was. They realized fairly early in that game how over that game was. So when you look at the pieces that are coming back, you have Trey Harris coming back to Ole Miss's team next year, 15 yards short of a 1,000-yard season, even though he missed like a quarter of the season. I think he's the best wide receiver in college football potentially, with Malik Neighbors and Marvin Harrison going to the NFL. I don't think Penn State would argue with it. I know they don't want any. They don't want any more. Definitely don't. And he had 54 catches, 985 yards, 8 touchdowns for Trey Harris. Like I said, he's going to be the best wide receiver in the SEC next year, maybe in the country. He's the one that everybody is going to get every eye in the secondary, and coverages are going to roll to him. And Ole Miss has weapons opposite of him that are going to make that kind of a difficult situation. When you look at the running back room, Quinshon Judkins, we talked about before the season that this might be the year that you see that Quinshon He doesn't have the 1,500 yards. He gets 1,200 yards, but he's actually more of an effective player than he was last season. And that has been exactly the case. I kind of nailed that one from in my August prediction. Quinshon had 271 carries, 1,158 yards, 15 touchdowns. I think he is like 2 or 3 touchdowns away from Deuce McAllister's record. He is probably 400 yards away from the career rushing record at Ole Miss. He is going to own every record that he can. If you go back and look at Jackson's numbers for a season, 233, 358, 33, 64, 23, and 5. He's going to own every meaningful passing record if he comes back, which we all assume he will as well. There's a lot to be excited about that's happening at Ole Miss right now. Then you look at the transfer portal with Walter Nolan, the number one player in the history of the transfer portal, defensive lineman coming into town. Penn State can run the football. Ole Miss, whenever they decided to get big and get real about it, they did a pretty good job stopping the run against those guys. They forced them into third down, third and medium, because that's all you had to do against that offense. And you were able to get the stops. You have Princely Amon Mielen, best pass rusher in the transfer portal. Tyler Barron, excellent sack man, pass rusher. The defensive end positions at Ole Miss, it's going to go up a level. TJ Dudley played in the Peach Bowl, played really well, honestly. Got me really excited about next season as well. I don't think he's going to play defensive end. I think he's going to move to a linebacker. And then you have like Chris Paul coming in, the top linebacker in the transfer portal. You have DeCameron Richardson, and you have Taz Nicholson coming in at cornerback. You have Key Lawrence. You have Louis Moore. You have those guys coming in, Tamari McDonald coming in at safety, to where Ole Miss is going to bring in next year, where this year they brought in like a group of 5 all-star team, which I am all a fan of that. Trey Harris and those guys came from the group of 5. But this year, Ole Miss is bringing on the defense side of the ball starters from SEC level teams. Somebody to actually fear. And with what's going to happen on the defensive line, with the return of Jared Ivey, with the return of J.J. Pegues, with those players coming back, the transfer portal, there's still stuff that can happen. When you look on the offensive side of the ball, the addition of Deion Smith and Juice Wells and those guys, Caden Lee, who hadn't hardly played all season, played against Penn State and he could have dominated that game. He was better than anybody that Penn State had in the secondary. I was a true freshman that has played 50 snaps all season. So I'm very excited about those that popped up, that stood out. And I'm very excited about what Ole Miss can be in 2024. And we're going to talk about it pretty consistently. Just finished my Under Armour All-American game. I hope everybody has a happy new year. TJ Banks, covered him extensively. Kamarion Franklin, he's enjoying the Peach Bowl. He's having a good time. He did not show up on time because he wanted to watch that football game, and nobody can blame him for that at all. Should be a lot of fun indeed. And today is my favorite day of the year. First day of the year is my favorite day of the year. And I'm going to watch college football, and I'm going to watch playoffs, and I'm going to just sit back and enjoy it and just daydream about what 2024 can be. Thanks for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen. Every day is tomorrow's show. We'll continue to be a little bit holiday-centric. We'll talk a little bit more about the Under Armour All-American game. And as the week, we'll start bringing our guest on to talk as well. For your second listen, Locked On Ole Miss has launched the first ever National Sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus the national shows that cover every single league. For your second listen, go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever National Sports 24/7 stream channel. For those on YouTube, we'll send you there right now. Hotty toddy.